But hello, good afternoon. Welcome to our third Special Collections and ZSR Library program for this spring on the next to last day of March, which is also Women's History Month. This recording is presented with the technical assistance of Rebecca Peterson-May, our Public Services Archivist. Thanks, Rebecca, for doing this. We have our final spring event coming in April, so please mark your calendars. On April 20th at 4 o'clock, Special Collections librarian Megan Mulder will partner with the Wake Forest University Press to discuss the Dolman Press, held by Special Collections, and its significance for Irish publishing in the 20th century. We are already busy planning our fall programs. Professor Peggy Smith will speak about her new book on Winston-Salem houses, and Mary Tribble from the Alumni Office will share about her new book on Sally Waite, wife of Wake's first president, Samuel. I would like to thank and acknowledge the donors who make these programs possible, specifically Kathy and Andy Liverman, class of '77, and other ZSR Board of Visitor members. Their support has allowed us to expand our outreach efforts like this one to a broader audience. Just some housekeeping items. Today's program is coming to you via Zoom, and yes, we will be able to see each other. Once the presentation is over, you'll be able to submit your questions in the chat or simply unmute yourself, and maybe we can even have a little bit of discussion. Megan will now introduce our speaker, Auburn professor Sunny Stalter-Pace. Megan.
Thanks, Tanya, and I'm so happy to see everybody this afternoon. This should be a really interesting talk. I've been asked before I introduce Sunny to say just a few words, just really briefly, about the Gertrude and Max Hoffmann collection, and specifically why we have it here at Wake Forest. This is a question that we get a lot because, unlike a lot of our manuscript collections, the Hoffmanns had no connection to Wake Forest, no connection to North Carolina. It's not, we're not an obvious place for this archive to live. But the reason we have it is basically that Harold Tedford of the Wake Forest Theater Department discovered the collection and purchased it for the library. I don't think Harold was going to try to be with us this afternoon. I'm not sure he was able to get logged on, but I'm sure he'll be able to see the recording, and we'll be very interested in that. But basically, for those of you who know Dr. Tedford and are familiar with his wide-ranging interests and passion for collecting, this all makes perfect sense. But the collection was basically acquired back in the late 1960s when Dr. Tedford was a fairly newly minted theater professor. He was building the library collections in the areas of theater history and theater art, so he was buying a lot of materials. And as I understand it, he just noticed the collection of the Hoffmann's personal papers for sale in a dealer catalog and thought it looked really interesting, and purchased it. The timing suggests that it was probably shortly after Gertrude's death, and since Max had died previously and they didn't have any living heirs, it makes sense that their papers would have perhaps been sold with their estate or something, and that's how it ended up in a dealer catalog. But at any rate, Dr. Tedford purchased the collection. It came to live in what was then called the Rare Books and Manuscripts collection here at ZSR Library. It was added to the collection, but fairly minimally processed. And it kind of, from what we can tell, it kind of sat for about 40 years without anybody really making a lot of use of it. But then in 2011, we had a graduate student intern named Rachel Ernst, who came in wanting to get some archival experience. And she also had a very strong background in music. So we assigned her to work with the Hoffmann collection, which had been identified as one of the collections in need of a much more robust finding aid. So if you look at the Hoffmann finding aid today, really all of the research, heavy lifting was done by Rachel. She's the one who really really took it on and made us realize, the real historical significance of the collection and of Gertrude and Max. And once she was finished, adding a lot of detail to the finding aid, we were able to put that out on the internet for researchers to discover. And one of the researchers that discovered it was Sunny Stalter-Pace, who in, I believe, 2015 was awarded one of our provost grants for library research, which is our research fund to support visiting researchers using our unique materials. So she was here in residence using the collection. We got to meet her, which was great. We had followed her career with great interest ever since, and are really delighted that she's with us this afternoon to kind of give us the next chapter in the life and the archive of Gertrude Hoffmann. So for those of you who don't know her already, Dr. Sunny Stalter-Pace is Hargis Associate Professor of American Literature at Auburn University. She received her PhD from Rutgers and her BA from Loyola University in Chicago. She specializes in the interdisciplinary study of American popular performance, literature, and urban space. She's published articles on American theater in the Journal of American Drama and Theater, Theater Symposium, and Transfer's Interdisciplinary Journal of Mobility Studies. Her new book, Imitation Artist, Gertrude Hoffmann's Life in Vaudeville and Dance, was published last year by Northwestern University Press. And we are, as I said, delighted to have her here today to tell us more about it. So I will turn it over to you, Sunny.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Megan. I really appreciate it. And before I get started with my thanks, I'll take a moment to thank the folks that Megan acknowledged, who made this collection possible and got it to a place where I could get involved and find out more about this amazing woman's life. So thank you all for coming. Thanks to Tanya Zanish-Belcher, Megan Mulder, Rebecca May, and Jamie Rogers Southern at Bookmarks Bookstore. This talk is called Glimpses of Gertrude, both because there's a fun biography by Craig Brown called 99 Glimpses of Princess Margaret, but also because today I really wanted to emphasize what writing a biography, and especially the first biography of a performer like Gertrude Hoffmann, felt like to me. Certain pictures, letters, diary entries, and artifacts gave me a fleeting impression of Hoffmann, like a glance out of the corner of my eye. So today I want to try and give you all a sense of that process of glimpsing Gertrude and piecing together her life as I tell you the story of one woman's remarkable career. And I have put the pictures over the slides for advancing the talk, but I can do it that way. Good deal. Okay. My first glimpse of Gertrude took place when I was looking for something else. Isn't it always the way? My first academic book was about literature set on the New York City subway. And I thought the second one was going to be about theatrical performances with that same setting. So while I was poking around on the New York Public Library digital collections site, I think the search term was Express Subway or something like that. I found a single page from a vaudeville program on the left. There was a routine set at the entrance to a subway station, including, intriguingly, a subway tango. I wanted to know who was responsible for this performance. And I looked up the performer in the Routledge Encyclopedia of Modernism. There I found out that this woman, Gertrude Hoffmann, whose review this program came from, had produced and performed in the first US productions of Michel Fokин's ballets performed in Paris by the Ballet Russe. Now, the Ballet Russe has always been known as the vanguard of modernist performance. So to hear a part of their story that I hadn't heard before, and to hear in particular that the first time Americans saw their dances in person, that they were done by a vaudeville performer, that seemed amazing, and I wanted to know more. So I dug into the archives at the Z. Smith Reynolds Library. I started putting together a family tree on Ancestry.com, and I hunted for traces of Hoffmann's early career in the California Digital Newspaper Collection. She was born in San Francisco, the youngest of 6 children, and named Catherine Gertrude Hay after her mother. The first picture of her on the left, wearing a marvelously extravagant hat, is one of the earliest photos in the Max and Gertrude Hoffmann photograph collection. There are a few of older relatives, but that's the earliest one I've been able to pinpoint that's of her. Because San Francisco was an epicenter of Victorian theatrical performance, Hoffmann found work at an early age as a ballet girl. This meant that she performed in a chorus of dozens or sometimes hundreds of young women who marched, sang, and otherwise provided the spectacular backdrop for the pantomimes and operas of the day. A newspaper story in the San Francisco Call described the ballet girl as, in their words, a real live beauty of the chorus who wears tights to breakfast and is sure her mother was a lady. That is meant to be sarcasm. Ballet girls were typically drawn from the working class, and their reputations differed from the modest feminine ideal. This illustration of Gertrude Hayes comes from that story. A high society gentleman asked several ballet girls in San Francisco to serve as pages for his Mardi Gras party, Gertrude among them. I love her saucy pose in this sketch, her mask and her beauty mark. She used several different versions of her name as a performer. Kitty Hay, Kitty Hayes, and Gertrude Hayes, the name used here. Once she married the musical director of a show in which she was performing, she settled on Gertrude Hoffmann. Hold on just a minute. There we go. Gertrude Hoffmann knew that she had reached the height of her popularity as a performer in the chorus in San Francisco. She had bit parts, solo dances, but nothing too major. Still in her teens, she joined the cast of The Night of the Fourth, a musical comedy that played in California over the summer and was headed back east. Now, I'm not great at identifying people in photos by face alone, but I think that Gertrude Hoffmann is the third dancer from the left in this chorus line. On the Midwestern leg of their tour, the company picked up a new musical director. Max Hoffmann was a Polish immigrant who lived in Chicago for more than a decade, writing songs and transcribing ragtime tunes he heard in local night spots for a sheet music publisher. The tour of The Night of the Fourth ended in New York City, where the show was a flop. But Gertrude and Max hit it off and married in March 1901. At that time, she and Max worked in a stock theater company that toured the southeastern US. Gertrude staged the dances and performed in the shows. Max composed and conducted the music. We can see one result of their collaboration from 1902, a piece of sheet music for a song written by Max, Sadie, My Creole Lady, with Gertrude posing for a photograph on the cover. And here we can see another result of their collaboration, their son, Max Jr. One of the topics I found most interesting while researching the early years of Hoffmann's career was figuring out how they took care of their young son when both of them worked nights. We can see one of the solutions on the left. Max Jr. stayed with Gertrude's mother in San Francisco while they toured, where he apparently hopped in an unattended buggy and tried to lead the horse to the bay to get his feet wet. Vaudeville houses typically went dark over the summer in the age before widespread air conditioning. So when the Hoffmanns traveled, they took Max Jr. with him, as you can see on the right, where he's sitting at the bottom of the steps wearing short pants and a nice little blouse with a bow. At this point in their career, the Hoffmanns worked from a home base in New York City. Oscar Hammerstein I, the father of the famous librettist, hired Gertrude Hoffmann as a dance director for his roof garden shows. She was the first woman to receive a credit as a dance director on a Broadway show for Hammerstein's Punch, Judy and Company in 1903. And here you can see from Museum of the City of New York what one of these roof gardens would have looked like. The pictures taken from the stage. So just imagine turning that way to watch the show. It wasn't until 1906 that Gertrude figured out what kind of performance would make her a star. Now we've come to the phase in Hoffmann's career that inspired my book's title, Imitation Artist. Early 20th century popular performance went through what historian Susan Glenn called the imitation craze. Vaudeville acts mimicked everything and everyone, from bird calls to orchestral conductors. Gertrude Hoffmann shook up her act in the summer of 1906 by adding imitations of celebrity performers. On the left, she's dressed as Eddie Foy Sr., or more accurately, as his character Sister Anne in the show Mr. Bluebeard. Gertrude Hoffmann's earlier acts depended on her grace and charm, but this one was pure physical comedy. But Gertrude didn't abandon her glamour altogether. She also crafted an imitation of the Parisian performer Anna Held, then the partner of Florenz Ziegfeld, and star in many of his shows. Max Hoffmann was hired as the musical director for the next Held show, A Parisian Model. Gertrude claims that she was doing her imitation of the star for other members of the cast when Anna Held walked in. Instead of getting angry, Held gave Gertrude notes on the parody and had it added to the show. The two women became close friends. For the rest of her career, Gertrude Hoffmann's vaudeville act included celebrity impersonations. She liked to arrange them for maximum contrast, like going from a clownish Eddie Foy to a glamorous Anna Held. Her imitations were covered extensively in the local newspapers. Here you can see two caricatures of her work, with the Anna Held impersonation on the left and Eddie Foy on the right. The center image is a send-up of Valeska Surratt, a vamp who sang a song called Why Do They Call Me a Gibson Girl? And many of you, even those of you who don't know who Valeska Surratt is, might know the Gibson Girl, drawn by Charles Dana Gibson. It appears in a lot of visual culture at the turn of the century. But Valeska Surratt sang this song in a show called The Belle of Mayfair. And there's not much to add with this picture. I just love it. Hoffmann added new imitations to her act over the next year, including Scotch comedian Harry Lauder, you can see in the front on the right, and vaudeville firebrand Eva Tanguay. And even if you don't know Eva Tanguay, if you're at all a classic movie fan, you probably know her signature song, I Don't Care, which Judy Garland sings in The Good Old Summertime. Gertrude Hoffmann's imitations had some wide-ranging consequences. When she added a Merry Widow Waltz burlesque to her act, the operetta's American producers sued her for copyright violation. Hoffmann won the suit, and news of her spunky defense spread through the press. At the same time, European society was celebrating Maude Allen for her expressive, sensuous version of Salome's Dance of the Seven Veils. It's Maude Allen on the left. Vaudeville theater manager Willie Hammerstein, Oscar the First's son, knew that Hoffmann was a skilled mimic, so he asked her to travel to England, take notes on Allen's dance, and perform a copy of it at his roof garden theater that summer. She did so to great acclaim and scandal. Her promotional photographs in costume, including ones where she posed with a prop John the Baptist head, as you can see, were sold as a subscription series by Theater Magazine. The Schuberts booked her as the headliner for their fall tour of the Mimic World, a show that spoofed popular Broadway performances for a nationwide audience. And here's some of the response. Cartoonist Claire Briggs gives his take on the response to Hoffmann's performance in Chicago. Grim matrons convey their shock and disgust as their husbands ogle and say things like, "I don't see anything wrong." When Hoffmann returned to New York City to revive a vision of Salome after her tour, she was arrested for indecency. The act was nearing its expiration date, and Hoffmann suspected her manager had set her up for the arrest to drum up business. She was released, but had to wear tights beneath her costume for the rest of the run. When the Hoffmanns went to Europe on their summer vacations, Gertrude was blown away by Serge Diaghilev's troupe called the Ballet Russe, whose performances of Michel Fokkin's ballets she saw in Paris over 2 different summers. She tried her best to book them to perform in New York City. And when she found out that they had a long-standing engagement in London, she decided to do what she did best and imitate them instead. Hoffmann put on unauthorized imitations of 3 Fokkin ballets that toured the US in 1912 and 1913, with copies of the original Paris production's costumes and sets, along with a huge cast. The production lost money in the first half of the tour until she added a program of her vaudeville imitations between the second and third ballets. The West Coast audiences adored it, and she was welcomed in San Francisco as a returning hero. "She has a punch in both hands," wrote a San Francisco critic, "one for the highbrows and one for the roughnecks." I love that. She followed this production with a more conventional book musical called Broadway to Paris, notable because it introduced her signature song, the Gertrude Hoffmann Glide, and because it's the only show of hers I've found where the full script is still extant at the University of Southern California. And how did this happen, that it was kept? Broadway to Paris was directed by Ned Wayburn, who Hoffmann had known since her early days in San Francisco. And Wayburn's scripts were purchased by John Olson and Chick Johnson, a comedy duo looking for old gags they could reuse. So it was in the Olson and Johnson collection. Very strange. In spite of her talents as a comedian, Gertrude Hoffmann always thought of herself as a dancer first. She reinvented herself as an aesthetic dancer in the vein of Isadora Duncan, and appeared many times in the pages of the new magazine Vanity Fair, where an article she wrote called "Dancing and the Magic of the Sea" was published. But Hoffmann went where she could get work, and by 1917, this meant back to revues in roof gardens and Flo Ziegfeld. She was cast in a Ziegfeld-produced revue called Dance and Grow Thin, with music by Blanche Merrill and Irving Berlin. And she did, as the picture on the left suggests, did a dance with a snake, which by then had become a kind of emblematic prop of diva identity. Vaudeville was waning in the late 1910s as movies grew in popularity. Gertrude Hoffmann made up some of the difference by appearing in promotional advertisements. Adam's Fruit Gum on the left, although I don't think that looks much like her at all, and in a promotional photograph for Harley Davidson on the right. And that is her son, Max Jr., sitting on the bike while she poses in the sidecar. Hoffmann turned her focus to ballet, first learning an Adolf Bohm dance called the White Peacock for her last solo vaudeville act in 1919. Bohm was a former performer in the ballet Ruse. And then Hoffmann put together what she called, in her words, a Native American ballet program, problematic in this case, that toured in the early 1920s. American ballet was in a weird in-between state in this era. It had moved beyond the ballet girls of Hoffmann's youth, but it was not yet seen as world-class as it would be after the arrival of George Balanchine. In the 1920s, Gertrude Hoffmann made the transition fully from performer to choreographer. She taught and managed troops of dancers, toured with them, and loaned them out to different Broadway shows. The Gertrude Hoffmann girls first appeared in the Ziegfeld Follies of 1923, performing the webbing act that you can see here. 12 ropes were lowered from the rigging near the front of the stage. Hoffmann girls ascended until they formed 3 rows on the ropes. Suspended by one foot, upside down and sideways, they moved through a bevy of patterns, sometimes holding on to one rope and sometimes to 2. The number ended with the girls swinging out over the audience. I really would love to have seen that in person. After their Broadway debut, the Hoffmann girls toured Europe. The second picture on this slide shows how they appeared in the Moulin Rouge program in 1924. The Hoffmann girls were notable among all-girl dance acts of the time for their athletic and individualistic styles. Though they performed some numbers in unison, the reviews from this number all celebrated the point in the show when each girl did her specialty tap dance, ballet solo, or acrobatic trick. Unlike the Tiller girls or the later Roxyettes or Rockettes, the Hoffmann girls could perform as individuals and as a group. Hoffmann taught at her own studio in this era, but she seldom performed. One of the few exceptions, pictured here, was a parody of German choreographer Mary Wigman, performed at a benefit in 1932. The Hoffmann girls performed in a wide variety of venues through the 1930s and 40s. They worked in nightclubs, as a part of restaurants' floor shows, and appearing in the live vaudeville acts before feature films. And their act was very much influenced by modern dance as well, as can be seen with this expressionistic performance promotional photo. During this era, Hoffmann spent time with the major figures of modern dance, including Charles Weidman, Doris Humphrey, and Jose Limon. The woman at the center of this photo with the white hair, glasses, and scrapbook is Ruth St. Denis, a dancer of Hoffmann's generation whose exoticizing interpretations of dances from India were very influential at the time. Hoffmann missed performing. Her papers are full of notes and budgets for a comeback performance that included a retrospective of her most famous dances and imitations, along with new material for the Hoffmann girls. The return to the spotlight, unfortunately, never took place. In 1945, at the age of 43, Gertrude's and Max's son died. This was one of the saddest things to note in her journal, whether because of her Christian Science faith or because the papers containing anything about it were destroyed for some other reason. Her journals from this era contain no mentions of her son's death. Only a few letters of condolence from friends remain in the archive to mark his passing. In the 1950s, Gertrude Hoffmann noted the ways that vaudeville was being revived on TV and remembered through movies like Singing in the Rain. She wrote a letter to Lucille Ball pitching that Ball should star in a film retrospective of Hoffmann's life and career. Coming across this letter in the archive, and especially the second page written in pencil on a paper napkin, was so moving because it gave me a sense of the fragility of her life and of her reputation. Gertrude and Max Hoffmann had talked about moving to Los Angeles since the end of the Second World War, when her sister Rose encouraged them to move west. They did not do so until 1961. And once they got there, Max hated it, writing a letter to the Schuberts asking for work in New York and a train ticket back home. He died in 1963. Gertrude lived another 3 years and died of a heart attack on October 21st, 1966. Piecing together her life from what remains in archives stretching from coast to coast, I found an artist, a dancer, a wife and mother, a woman who personified vaudeville at its prime, and who tried to ensure that her story would outlive her. I would be happy to open the floor to questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunny.
So anybody who wants to know more, if there's a slide I went through too quickly, I was trying to give you sort of a vaudeville razzle dazzle performance of the illustrations, but if there's anything I can go back to, I'd be happy to do that too.
I'll start with a question. Sunny, what did you find most interesting about Gertrude and her life?
So much. I mean, I think the thing I really grabbed onto is something super fascinating and maybe not as true today of performers in her era, was this idea that she found her voice through imitation. So figuring out who she was as a performer by doing imitations of other performers. And then becoming, you know, a nationwide celebrity by copying a dance from London. That just seemed really fascinating to me.
Hi, Sunny. Thank you so much. I love this collection, and I'm so excited to hear more about your research. I have a question, and Megan and I have an ongoing joke that we need to do a presentation about Gertrude called "Hey, That's My Grandma," because we get so many questions from descendants of Hoffmann girls who say, "My grandmother was a Hoffmann girl. Can you find her picture?" And then we find some, you know, really racy pictures, and we're like, "Is that your grandma?" So have you spoken with any descendants of women or other men who worked with her and in her troupe and traveled with her? Or any remaining living Hoffmann girls, anything like that?
Remaining Hoffmann girls, not yet. I would love to, but I have spoken to two women who were related to Hoffmann girls. One of whom came into the Brooklyn Public Library and did a "Hey, that's my grandma" kind of thing. And the other one whose aunt, who was sort of the, you know, scandalous black sheep aunt who was in beauty pageants and swimsuit pageants, and then ended up being in the very last troupe of Hoffmann girls to go overseas. In 1939, they were supposed to be in a London review, and they actually had to go back home because the war started.
So I have sort of a jumble of comments that I'm gonna act as though they're a question. So the first thing I wanted to say is just how cool is it for an imitation performer to be a recording technology? Like I just kept thinking like Gertrude Hoffmann was like the living YouTube. That it was like, you really want to see Ballet Russe, like go see her do this. And then also she'll do like a funny thing so it's not so boring. Like it's briefer than the real thing. So that was my first overall comment, is it's hard to imagine, but very suggestive that a body can be like a recording technology. And then I also wanted to say, because I've done work on Vanity Fair magazine, that this just opened my eyes. Like she's so often pictured in Vanity Fair. And I think I have even written about that Salome photo, but it's so, again, mind-blowing tonally that she's a parodist / imitator. Like, so when it appears in the magazine, it looks like awfully highbrow. And so I read it that way, like not having any idea who she was. So I just think that is also so fascinating and strange to think about, like, what is the tone of reproducing a publicity photo of someone who's like simultaneously like a vaudeville comedienne, but also it sounds like people were also receiving her as like the messenger of these acts. It wasn't just like everything she did was like the Chaplin-esque version of the original.
No, some of them were really straight reproductions. She did like an Isadora Duncan Blue Danube Waltz that was super straight. She did a Ruth St. Denis kind of exotic dance that was super straight. But yeah, the idea that Hoffmann's body was the recording technology, because she was such a good stage manager and production designer, and she had that experience as a choreographer. That's how she could go to London and see Maude Allen and, you know, watch how she did it and really try to get down the mood, try to get down the music, try to get down the, you know, Maude Allen's really known for like her hand movements being very sinuous. And there's something about Hoffmann's training, you know, on stage and backstage that just gave her a lot of facility with reproducing those European performances. That was her genius.
That's tremendous. I also, looking at the Hoffmann girls, can't help but think of the like much later representation of vaudeville girls in Gypsy. So I'm sort of thinking of Gertrude Hoffmann as Mama Rose, but that actually also makes that accomplishment that you noted even more impressive, that rather than trying to make all of the vaudeville girls look like her or look like each other, in addition to knowing how to imitate, she also knows how to do a star turn for different comedian and dancer types. That is an extraordinary facility too, because it speaks to an understanding of the culture of performance and of feminine celebrity that she like wasn't afraid to share as a mentor, it sounds like.
Right. I mean, she ended up from the very beginning, when she was a ballet girl, you know, she got an extra, you know, whatever little bit of salary a week because she was the one who trained the girls in her line to teach them the numbers. So she was always someone who was used to working with huge groups of women and thinking about how to move women around and how to show them off in different ways. And she got into arguments with people like Ned Wayburn because she said, they're just drill sergeants. I can do the moves that I'm asking these girls to do, and they can't.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Sunny. A really exciting project and presentation.
Hi, Sunny. I'm Kaylee McMahon. I'm the librarian who works with our theater and dance department. So I was very excited to see that you were going to present on this, and I've loved watching Craig over the years doing some of the preservation on the posters and photographs and things like that. It's been a joy to watch, and I've been fascinated just about her story, the little I've known, but this has opened it up a lot, and I didn't realize how much variety she was in. Like the ballet and the vaudeville and the modern dance feel so separate, and the fact that she was able to do all of them, it seems well, proficiently, successfully enough to make a living out of it, is really interesting to think about. And I was so interested to hear you mention Ned Wayburn, because I just pulled a book. Like, he had in our stacks, we had a guidebook that he wrote in the 20s, I think, to try to like get girls to come to New York to his dance company. And I used it for years as a primary source example in the dance history courses. So it's just funny to get a little bit more insight about who he was, and that she might have fought with him. And I always thought, yeah, he doesn't really look like he could do any of the stuff that he's asking these girls to do. So specifically the diet that he had them on was, cottage cheese and a lettuce leaf and, half an apple or something like that. And you're like, yeah, he does not have their best interest at heart in this. But anyway, I digress. But I would just be interested to hear a little bit more about the different things that our collection has, because I know we have like the posters and the photographs, but was there musical scores in there from Max and like other, like kind of some of that other stuff that we have in our collection, for information?
Yeah, there's a ton of music that Max had arranged, and I don't read music, so I was sort of at a loss with that. But the primary sources in this collection that I worked with the most were there are about 5 or 6 journals that she kept, and this was all from pretty late in her lifetime, but they're amazing. Some of them are, trying to think back on her early life in San Francisco. She talks about, her mother making her clean their apartment and how she got a job as a ballet girl so she didn't have to clean the apartment anymore. But, God bless the librarians and the work study assistants who scanned pages and pages of these diaries for me, because they're super amazing. There's stories about Max stealing the score to a Parisian model, and Flo Ziegfeld trying to have him arrested. Just all kinds of, things that need to be in biographies and things that need to be in biopics. There's scrapbooks. Trying to think of anything else really, really cool. The diaries were the thing I got into the most. And there's a couple of letters, again, pretty late in her career, where Hoffmann was in correspondence with current and former Hoffmann girls, and just saying really sweet things about, oh, my mother taught me never to hate anyone, so I'm sorry that you're feeling sad about being half Jewish, because the Jewish people are responsible for all kinds of wonderful things in the theater world. Like, she was just such a lovely, lovely person. But yeah, the posters, the big, what are they like? The big posters of the Hoffmann girls that were restored from when they were in Cannes, I think. Those are totally amazing.
Thank you so much. And I will tell you, I made sure that I ordered your book at the beginning of your time. Made sure that we had the question. So just to let you know.
Wonderful.
And if anyone's interested, I did just put a link to the finding aid for the collection in chat if anyone wants to see a list of what's in the Hoffmann collection, and come and visit it anytime. But Sunny, I had a question sort of on our theme of Women's History Month, which is, could you speak to a little bit about how significant was it that for Gertrude to be a woman composer and manager of her own dance troupe? Was this like really unusual for the time? How did she have peers? What was that like?
Well, it's funny. It was unusual for the time, but it's actually a little bit, it aligns her more with old fashioned kind of theater, what do you call them? Actor managers from the 19th century, like Laura Keene. But it was unusual for her to work with all different vaudeville houses, rather than just staying in with one particular kind of with one particular producer. And it took a lot. One of the things that was a little bit sad about her obituaries in '66 is the thing that people acknowledged was not her artistic talent or her ambition. It was that she was a skilled businesswoman. But I think one of the things about having these big troops and having these transatlantic tours is, she had to be just an incredibly skilled businesswoman to manage the contracts and the budgets and the costumes and all of that.
Another question. Based on your slides alone, it seems like there's pockets of Gertrude across the country of archival materials, New York, San Francisco. Where did you find your other big finds? Like, what was your research process like? We know what it was like with us, but clearly you've been working on this for a while. So can you tell us about that a little bit?
Well, my other place that I really depended on for materials for this book was the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center. They have a lot of material just about different dance from that period. So I could sort of see, what the actual Ballet Ruse was doing then and compare the program for their production with the one that Hoffmann had made for her production, things like that. So that was the other place I tended to look. And a lot of material that I found about her family was just through Ancestry, looking at censuses and passport applications, things like that. Oh, and one more thing, and this is something I will actually try to put in the chat because it's amazing. The Internet Archive is a repository that has a bunch of scanned material, and the most relevant material for my work and for anybody who wants to work on popular performance is all filtered through this site called lantern.mediahist.org. Basically, it's a searchable database of all of the movie magazines, vaudeville, trade newspapers, has a full run of Variety all the way through the 40s. And that is the digital resource that I use the absolute most, just in trying to figure out sort of day to day what Hoffmann was doing, where she was appearing, what kind of shows she was working on, and how they were getting talked about in the press. And that was also good because I could access it at home while I was taking care of a little kid.
Hi, Sunny.
Angie.
I have a question about her arrest for indecency.
Mhm.
I'm just curious about that in general, but that photo with the head of John the Baptist, was that part of what scandalized people? I mean, obviously that head had to be in the performance originally
Mhm.
anyways.
Yeah.
Was that
Yeah.
part of what scandalized people, or was it just her legs that had something to be?
Well, Hoffmann, um, so the Salamania, what they called it, when people started doing vaudeville performances of the Dance of the Seven Veils, kind of based on Oscar Wilde's play and kind of based on the opera. Those all ended up being more scandalous because of the nudity.
Okay.
But when they did the original dress rehearsal of the opera at the Met, the head was the thing that freaked people out.
Wow.
Because they said that the person, did a kind of very lascivious and long like kiss of the prop head.
Yeah.
So it tended to be one or the other, but in Hoffmann's case, it was almost always her legs.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Anybody got any other burning questions?
You haven't found anything out about the communist letters in the collection yet, have you?
No, I
It's still a
haven't.
mystery.
I
They're just
think
this small cache of letters from addressed to different names, not Max and Gertrude, but from the American Communist Party. And we don't know why they're there or what. I like to think of the Hoffmans as undercover agents, a la, the Americans, but there is zero evidence for that. So I wondered if you had encountered anything.
Yeah, and I looked at the address and compared it to where they lived in Hollywood, and it was far enough away that in a totally different town.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we may never know. All right. Right. Well, if there aren't any other questions, if you have a last minute question, go ahead and ask it now. But if not, yes, please join me in thanking Sunny for a great session. I'll go out and get a copy of her book. I'm looking at the one that we have here in the collection and can't wait to read it. It sounds really interesting. And yeah, we will look forward to any further information that you have on Gertrude or the Hoffmans in general. And thank you so much. This was such a great session.
Yeah,
Thanks
so
to everybody
much,
for
and
being here.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Sunny.
Thanks.